Brilliant. Well, while Victoria carries on letting people in, a very, very warm welcome to today's Leaf Surgery. I'm Claire Mike. I'm Director of Technical and Business Development here at Leaf. And just before we get started, a little housekeeping. We are recording today's session and we do encourage questions from our audience. So please do pop these into the chat function. And my colleague Victoria joining me today will help us out with the Q&A session towards the end of today's surgery. So today I am absolutely delighted to welcome John Seed and Todd Jex to share a little bit about their experience on the NCS, or Nitrogen Efficiency Plants for Climate Smart Arable Cropping Systems project. Wow, that is a big well done to me for getting that out without stuttering. The project is around the incorporation of pulses and legumes into the crop rotations in the UK and has the potential to offer huge benefits across economics, soil health, the environment, and as well as reducing our reliance on imported soya. However, with pulses and legumes currently only accounting for around 5% of UK cropping, there are clearly some significant barriers to overcome. So NCS is a farmer-led research project aiming to both quantify those benefits and really drive that positive change within the industry. So today, as I mentioned, we're welcoming John Seed, who farms with his wife Louise and son Donald at Woodend on the Scottish borders. There's about just over 200 hectares, and the family farm produces oats, barley, beans, wheat, and free-range eggs. Sustainability and resilience are really key drivers for John and his family, and they've long advocated environmentally positive farming practices. As a pulse pioneer in the NCS project, John is looking at how homegrown legumes can benefit both his arable and his poultry enterprises, and very keen to share his experiences with us today. So thank you, John. Todd Jex has been an agronomist for over 14 years and has the Farmers Weekly Arable Advisor of the Year in 2023. Todd believes in flexible and farm-specific approaches, as we do here at Leaf, and to maximise yields and profitability whilst enhancing environmental health. He's a firm advocate of the benefits of legumes and what they can bring to a rotation. And today, hopefully, we'll be sharing insights into that practical application and some tips for success. So welcome to you both. And without any further ado, Todd, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay, to kick things off. I'd love you to tell us a bit more about the NCS project, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so as you've already alluded to, Claire, it's a farmer-led project with industry partners looking at how we can use some of the benefits around legumes in the rotations for livestock, but also to then reduce soya imports, which could have a massively positive impact on the greenhouse gas emission targets, the ambitious ones that the UK government set, but also on farm to deliver some reductions in carbon footprint to farming businesses.
Sorry, schoolgirl error, stayed on mute. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Thank you. John, if I could come to you next, what initially drew you to get involved with the NCS project? And were there any particular challenges or opportunities that you personally were looking to explore?
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. As Claire said, we're a mixed regenerative farm, and we have arable crops, free-range hens, and renewable energy systems, and they all work together in a joined-up way. And the NCS project, in a way, mirrors how we deal with farming, because it's a system. It isn't just an independent enterprise. It's all interdependent on the whole. So pulses, beans offer an opportunity to connect the dots a bit between the feeding the hens, addressing costs and carbon emissions and biodiversity and soil health. The thing is that we'd been trialing on our own before the NCS came along. So we'd been trying to grow lentils, we'd grown lupins, we'd grown peas, we'd done intercropping. But for a wee farm like us on our own, it's an expensive process and it's a risky process. And if you're a poultry producer, if your hens go off the lay, everything goes out the window because you stop getting any money. So the NCS project brought structure, it brought evidence, and it brought a community of people together And so we've got the likes of SRUC doing poultry feed trials, PGRO doing crop trials, Agri doing trials with Todd, and a lot of farmer-led work through the Pulse Pioneers. It's, you know, proper citizen science. And this collaborative, practical and systemic approach is what it needs. It allows us to deal with all sorts of aspects, the manure management, the soil quality, and the research and support being across the whole cycle helps. And that's the right way, in my opinion, for research to be done. And what made us begin this process is that we started doing carbon audits about 5 years ago. We worked out that nearly 80% of our carbon emissions came from imported feeds. So it was mostly soya and sunflower. And carbon emissions are just cost. It costs more at that time, perhaps not so today. Today's a bit of an outlier, hopefully, but perhaps not. You know, soya was £500 a ton. Beans were trading much less. So it was practical to replace protein, homegrown protein, to replace the soya with that. And the ability to collaborate and lay that risk off and not have to do it ourselves, and to learn from other practitioners. There's a lot of people been growing beans. It's a well-established crop. Some of the things that are different for us is that trying to balance the amino acid. You know, hens are sensitive. They need specific amino acids like methionine, which helps eggshell and feathers and other things. And so beans are actually relatively low in that. There's a case for plant breeding and improving that. But without having that discussion in the room with the plant breeders, with the millers and others, you can't identify or address those problems. So the drivers for me, the first one was cost, because we were spending an awful lot of money when we started doing this on imported soya, and growing our own made a lot of sense. Having feed autonomy and not being exposed to the risks that go with that, the more resilient you are, the more you produce yourself, the less exposed you are to those things. So it addressed that as well. Carbon reduction is being demanded by everyone, and changing from imported to homegrown product, when you take the whole life cycle into account, that's massive. And then there's been real other benefits in terms of nitrogen sequestration, improving soil health. And we are, because we're a farm that we're producing our own feed and feeding it to our hens, we see the linkage, you know, the manure's going on the ground, we're growing the wheat, we're feeding that to our hens, we're feeding the beans to our hens, feeding oats to our hens, we see the soil health improving. And we're also looking at the impact it has on pollinators and insect predators. We don't use insecticides at all, and we found that by having beetle banks, that's a established beetle bank behind me, it makes a huge difference and increases the yield. So there's all that learning taken together. That's I guess in short form, the real thing about NCS is taking the risk away from us as a small family farm, and trying to work out how to do that. And it's handing it out to the wider community of farmers, researchers, and also the end users, the retailers and others. So it's a most fantastic project, in my opinion.
Thank you, John. I love how you so wonderfully illustrated that circular farming system you have on the farm, and I love that you've shared that you're integrating that waste back in, etc. That is brilliant, and equally great to hear that the community engagement, the collaboration that's happening within the project, and the fact that it's farm-based research, farmer-led research, but there is that science base underpinning that from SRUC, PGRO, etc. So yeah, what a great example of how we can get the most out of projects. So thank you for that. Todd, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. So I'd love you to share what you think the main benefits of including pulses into crop rotations are, particularly from your agronomic perspective would be great. And when we're integrating pulses into a rotation, what are some of those key considerations?
Okay, Claire. Yeah, well, I think they're a really important cornerstone that should be considered within all arable rotations. There's no doubt about it when you're looking at performance of first wheats, which for most people, unless you're fortunate enough to be in some of the more fertile, lighter root crop / veg soils over in East Anglia and the other parts of the country, then where I am and the vast majority of the country, it's about first wheats. It's building a rotation to successfully grow first wheats, because that's where the margin is in an arable cropping situation. So it's always looking for these break crops which deliver you a good wheat afterwards. And we all know the challenges that have been present, and they've been present for a number of years with crops like oilseed rape. As good as oilseed rape is, and it can be very profitable indeed, we can't grow it closer than certainly 1 in 4, but we probably shouldn't be growing it closer than 1 in 5 or 6 to actually get the best out of it. And that aside, even when grown in a wide rotation, it's a challenge. We've got issues of cabbage stem flea beetle. The rape winter stem weaver is a rising threat certainly in the middle of the country. And then we get seasonal things like pigeon attacks and slugs being a nuisance. So oilseed rape is not without problems, and the acreage has dropped. You know, there was an article in the Farmers Weekly last autumn saying it was at a 40-year low. So we know oilseed rape area has been on the decline for a while and is currently very low. And that was one of the key break crops in the arable rotation. So beyond that, it is looking at peas and beans. And certainly, when we look at some of the benchmarking data over the last 10 years, the performance after a pill bean crop from a first wheat is generally better. I think that's a combination of better establishment from that freely available nitrogen afterwards, but also there's no carryover of slugs, there's no carryover of aphids to cause problems. And if you're growing winter beans, much like winter oilseed rape, it gives you the opportunity to use some of the most effective different chemistry against grass weeds. Again, going back to the autumn, there were well-documented issues around the discovery of glyphosate-resistant grass weeds in the UK, Italian ryegrass, and there's now more than one farm in which that's been discovered. So that's a real challenge moving forwards. Much of the country already suffers with blackgrass. There's brome and there's Italian ryegrass as well. And being able to use propyzamide within that rotation to keep grass weeds in check, it's one of the only active ingredients still remaining in the arable rotation that there isn't any level of resistance or insensitivity to. So I think that's really important. So moving forward, I see peas and beans playing a bigger part in the rotation, but much like the oilseed rape, and probably less talked about, to get the best out of them as well, we need to consider having enough of a break from them. It's not sensible to try and grow those too close together in a rotation. We shouldn't be growing them more than 1 in 4, perhaps 1 in 5 or 6 actually. So it's about how we put that together. But there's a lot of benefits to be had, both agronomically and environmentally, from legumes.
Thanks, Todd. I think that's really fascinating. I mean, we talk a lot about the nitrogen fixing benefits of legumes, etc., but it's so brilliant to hear all the other benefits, environmental benefits that can be unlocked, pest resistance, disease resistance, etc. And so fascinating also to hear that it is not a silver bullet. You know, you also need to manage pulses in rotation carefully as well. So that's really useful. Thank you very much for that. So, John, I'm going to come back to you if that's okay. I'm going to very cheekily ask you 2 questions, if that's okay. So I'd love to, let's start with the first and then we can come on to the second. From your own experience, what were the drivers for you incorporating pulses? You shared a little bit about that in your introduction, but I'd love you to, perhaps elaborate on that, even that decision-making process. How did you even start thinking about it? Did you see others doing it around you? And what have been some of those challenges and rewards for yourself?
So we were looking for homegrown pulses to deal with the cost of soya and to reduce the emissions. We were being pushed to that by our retailers and packers, and because we're both producing eggs and cereals, we sell milling oats and malting barley and feed wheat as well. So all these people want to see carbon reduction, and on the farm as a whole, it was mainly coming from those 80% was imported soya mostly. So we were trying to reduce the carbon, and it's plain the reason we have so many renewables. Carbon emissions are cost for most farmers. Right? I can't see where by reducing carbon you don't generally reduce your costs. So that was the driver. And today, more than 60% of our feed is grown on the farm. We're still using a little bit of soya, and that's down to the where we are with beans. we tried, as Todd said, you know, it's 1 year in 5 is the closest you would really want to be growing beans. So we had to look at protein per hectare was what drove us. So how could we produce the largest amount of protein that we could feed to hens within the land that we were farming? And so we'd tried intercropping peas and beans with spring barley or wheat. We tried peas and beans together. We tried lentils. We tried all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, growing beans properly and paying proper attention to the agronomy and the costs and trying to maximize the yield was the best way to get protein. So that's why we went with that. But we're unusual in that most pig and poultry producers who might use beans and might replace soya aren't arable farmers, and they aren't feed millers, and so they don't see that, you know. So the risk that if you just take the poultry unit on its own is that the protein makeup in beans hasn't been, fava beans particularly haven't had the same level of plant breeding attention in terms of yield or fitness for purpose. When I started researching should we feed beans to our hens, the only research note I could find 5 years ago was an old SAC one from the 1960s that said when your hens get towards the end of lay, if you feed beans, it makes the eggs a wee bit smaller. And it was based on Morris bead and varieties that have been grown. My grandfather probably, or father would be growing them. So the problem in some ways is that everybody's in their own silo. The good thing about NCS is that it shakes all that out and exposes it. I mean, I could see it on my own farm because we both produce our feed, mill it and feed it to the hens and use the manure. But in a lot of cases that doesn't happen, those things aren't joined up. And so some farmers are reluctant to grow beans because the elm scheme came along and they started to grow other environmental crops where they got a payment, and they couldn't see the market for, you know, there's a limited demand apparently for beans. Feed millers are reluctant to deploy equipment to add beans because it means setting aside silos, storage, and there's no guaranteed market. People who feed, you know, if you start feeding a hen beans when it's 16 weeks old, it expects to be getting beans when it's 100 weeks old. So you need to have enough beans to feed them over their whole lifetime. And so, you know, a miller there's a lot of places in the chain where there's a decision made where it's just been too much trouble, where there isn't the guaranteed market, there isn't the guaranteed margin, it doesn't justify the capital investment. And I think what the NCS project is doing is exposing that, and it's letting people see the circularity of it all and the benefit that if people are feeding homegrown beans to hens, you get manure, it can be applied, it can be used to grow wheat, and you know, there's all that carbon saving that goes with it. So it's trying to overcome that issue. And so my piece to resistance for this is it's the chicken and egg problem, isn't it? As a poultry producer, you've got to get that in there. And so there's limited demand and infrastructure for beans. So how would we resolve that? I guess the way to resolve that would be to have somebody in the chain who oversees the whole chain, and it can say, we want beans, we want homegrown protein in the diet. And I think the people that are best placed to do that, there are 3 groups of them, and really they're not in the room so much in the NCS project, but they should be looking and paying attention. And that would be the policymakers, the funders, and most of all are the retailers, because it's if the retailers were to say we want to see 5% of protein fed to pigs and poultry and dairy cows to come, or even 2% coming from homegrown sources, that would make it possible for arable farmers with confidence to sow the crop, knowing there's a demand. That would allow grain merchants to put contracts out there and bulk it up and sell it to millers. It would allow millers to set aside new silos to store it and mill it and make sure they've got enough quantity to supply the demand. And that's what the NCS project exposes, that problem, and it also provides a solution. It shows we are lucky that we're a joined up circular farm. We're growing it, we're feeding it, we're milling it, we're doing everything. So it all crystallizes, the carbon saving crystallizes and is inset in the eggs we produce, and also in the malting barley and the milling oats and the feed wheat that we produce. But that can be applied to the different sector. The problems that arable farmers are facing is they get pushed by the support scheme to grow things for elms that may not perhaps be, they're not going to sustain the agricultural ecology or the business as such, but they could grow beans if they knew there was a market for it. So it's the role of the retailers in this and others who would make it all happen. I think I've wandered a long way away from your question, but what would help farmers adopt policies and grow policies, because it's farmer-led. Farmers, ultimately, we're price takers. We do what we're told. People think that we're rational skeptics. We'll do what makes sense if it's going to make money, but people aren't going to grow beans if there's not going to be a demand for it. If their perception is that the policy is going to disappear or the demand's going to disappear because the retailers don't care whether there's homegrown protein or soya from the middle of the Brazilian jungle. You know, it's those are the things that drive it. So it's having stable demand, commitment from retailers, from merchants, from millers, from end users. Everybody needs to have that certainty, and that comes from policymakers, it comes from funders, and it comes from the retail sector. And then people need advisory and agronomy support. That's what Todd provides, and I use Agri as my agronomists, and they're fantastic, and they have that whole network of knowledge, and they speak to each other as people do, and so you need that as well. And given all of that in the policy, then the NCS can deliver what it's set up to do: huge carbon reduction, huge biodiversity increase, and a bit more certainty and guaranteed profitability, and that very, very important entry for first wheats, which is what most farmers really want. That's where the market is, and reduced nitrogen costs. That was your first question.
Oh, yeah, what a brilliant advocate you are. Well, you kind of answered my second question within it, so I'm going to ask you another cheeky second question. But just before I do, yeah, I don't think we couldn't agree more. There needs to be a food system change, and every actor within that food system needs to take responsibility for enabling that change to happen. I love your chicken and egg analogy. Of course, we needed to get that in. Brilliant. One very quick question, John, just out of curiosity. Do you manage to produce everything that you need for your own demand for your poultry enterprise, or do you rely on neighbours to help you out and things like that?
So the issue with we can't do it all with beans, because the methionine level is too low in the plant in the crops that are available to us. We need the plant breeders to address that, and that'll take time to happen. So we're still buying some soy in, and we're having to buy in methionine as an additive to deal with that. And there's a point, the cost benefit point, where the cost of having to feed, if you start feeding a lot of protein but it's not all being used by the hens, then you start to increase the crude protein, you increase carbon emissions, you get horrible wet muck. And so we are still using a fair proportion of soya at the moment to address that issue. Hens need fiber, and we've been buying in sunflower mainly for fiber, but also for energy and protein levels. We've started using some oats, but it makes, you have to be economically rational as well. So selling milling oats, dressing off the light oats and feeding them to hens, and then topping it up with sunflower. So we are still buying some of those things in. As far as the collaboration with neighbours and other things, we buy some wheat from neighbours and others. We buy in some oats from time to time if we need that. If we're selling, it's a balance all the time. And we also can see that we use as much of the manure as we can, but there are times when it's more valuable to other people, and it makes sense for us just when our hens turn around to sell some of it. So there's a lot of collaboration that way. But I think that is it's a problem and a solution. That there's a huge poultry and pig industry in the UK. There needs to be more joined up between the arable farming and the poultry side. And we're able to do that here because we mainly control all that we do, and we work with friends and neighbours. But on a UK-wide basis, recognition of the benefits of poultry manure, of the benefits of growing policies, need to be seen by the different sectors. And there needs to be more conversations and collaborations to make the best of it.
Brilliant, thank you. And let's hope, projects like this are the beginnings of those conversations, John. So thank you. Todd, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. And I might ask this of you as well, John. In your view, what are the main things that are holding farmers back from adopting legumes more widely?
Well, I think John's actually probably answered that question almost already, but I think there's three key factors that are having a big influence. I think market will always drive everything. So the price that's available, the gross margin per hectare that's achievable, it's not probably where it should be. It's not reflective of the value probably that they could bring to the food chain, they could bring to the environment, and then linked to that, which I think is a massive piece. And I think, in my opinion, the government got it very wrong with how they rolled out the SFIs and ELMs, as John was alluding to. I think they could have done so much more, and I know in Europe and Ireland they did, to encourage growth and uptake of leguminous crops in the UK. Instead, what we've ended up with is a lot of fallow options and ground being taken out of that arable rotation. So we're not really seeing the benefits, and actually what we're having is some of the disadvantages associated with that, like grass weeds and things. So I think that's a shame. I think there was a real chance to do something more positive there that never materialized. And the third part, which again John raised, definitely is, and you can't blame them because of the current market, the investment from breeders, the investment from R&D agronomy companies like Agri and others. I think the work there hasn't been, it's not the same level that's going on in the background with leguminous crops that there is with cereals and wheat in particular. The market's just not large enough, which is disappointing. We could just do with some more work on newer varieties coming through, agronomy, trying to maximize performance out of these crops, and also some more novel things, like John said, of trying to look for particular traits that might help in particular markets, in his case with chickens. But I'm sure the same if you had a poultry farmer on, he'd be able to tell you how they could improve the quality and the makeup of the amino acids in the beans to suit their business.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I think that's really important in terms of, the government understanding, or any source of funding for farmers understanding what, how they might best target that. And again, projects like this should help shape some of that thinking. Look, you both answered quite a lot of my questions already, so I'm just going to kind of fast track onto the final question. So before we wrap up and we open up the questions to the audience, I'd love to know, is there one or two standout insights or learnings that you've both taken away from the project so far that might have challenged your thinking, or just something that you're going to take away? And as a kind of bonus question, what could happen next if we managed to secure another round of funding? Is there anything that you think we could go on to explore next? John, if we come to you first with that question, and then Todd, I'll ask you the same question.
I guess it's a rediscovery of the role that policies play, the way they pull the whole thing together. They feed the livestock, they fix nitrogen, they reduce emissions, they reduce costs, they improve soil quality, they reduce fertilizer costs. They're not a crop, but it's not new. My grandfather was been growing pulses for years and years, but they've been lost for a little while. And I entirely agree with what Todd said, that the policy mistake was in supporting fallow crops that actually have led to problems with grass weeds and perhaps have not had the impact it should have had. We should have mirrored what they did on the continent and supported homegrown protein as a crop for food security purposes, for emission reduction, for biodiversity. It would have achieved all of those things, and it would have helped to underpin and make UK farming more resilient. So it's been a real loss that hasn't done. And the policymakers need to pick that up, because at the moment farmers are making poor choices, and I think that many of them know in their heart that it's not the right thing to do, but they can't move here because it needs the retailers, it needs the feed millers, the merchants, and the pig and poultry producers to have that, to be able to make the commitment. The other part that isn't discussed is that if they're paying to produce homegrown protein on the continent, we're seeing liquid egg, fresh eggs, pig pig and chicken meat coming into the UK from the continent, where they've had lower costs of production because they've been supported in that role. Whereas I've had to pay for growing homegrown protein myself. And today it's more expensive feeding beans than it is buying soya. So the policy, it would help a lot if they did those things. And it would leave the farms, the land, and the people in better heart. It would make things work better. It's very satisfying to go out and look at a beetle bank, look at beans growing, know that the system's working properly, and all the things that we're doing are positive and productive and are underpinning a resilience. And I think that that's what hopefully the NCS project does that. But that's been my learning. It's not new, and somehow people forget it and they run off because they're in their silo. The research and policy is often discipline and enterprise bound with funding and the effort going into specific things. This holistic approach that the NCS brings, bringing the whole cycle of, the circle of life together, is what makes the difference. And it's what matters holistically. And there's a lot of blind spots that are missed because of that. So hopefully that'll be addressed. And I think if beans are a Cinderella crop. If you remember, Cinderella was sent away to sort the beans out from the ashes. So to get Cinderella to the ball, we need to have policy. We need a fairy godmother. We need either the retailers or the policymakers or the funders to stand up and get behind this, so that all the different people in the chain can deliver the things that we need to deliver. That's my learning, and that's what when I started doing this and being in the NCS project, that's what people need to recognise from what's going on. Because today it is a Cinderella crop, and it is messing around sorting beans out from ashes, and we need to get it back into the fields where it belongs and put the money and the effort behind it.
Thank you, John. What a wonderful storyteller you are. Quick question. Have you experimented with growing homegrown soya at all, or is that not possible where you are?
I think that's a question for Todd.
I'll ask Todd that question. Brilliant. So Todd, can I come to you then for the same question? We'll come on to the soya in a moment. The same question. What insights or tidbits, really juicy bits, have you got out of the project?
Well, as John's said, a lot of the things are the bits of knowledge that have been there for a long time. Really, they're not new things as such. Although I think as time goes on and we do more trials looking at various different things, we realise there still is a lot more that we don't know enough about, and things that we could do a lot better. I think within that, some of the most staggering things we've seen is the negative impact of compaction. I know the PAGRO have seen similar and collected data to show that 40% yield reductions are really possible in crops where that hasn't been looked at properly. And I think although I think everybody is aware of compaction, I'm not so sure that awareness always turns into action being taken prior to planting a crop. And I think what we're starting to realise very quickly with the work that we've been doing is that the legume crop is sort of the canary in the coal mine. If you've got a problem with your soil health, particularly from a physical or structural point of view, then it's going to show up. So they're exacerbated problems. You might get away with 4 or 5 cereal crops without seeing how bad that problem is. And if you get a bad spell of incredibly wet weather or drought and you've got a legume crop, and unfortunately that tends to bear the brunt, and it will highlight that. So compaction has been a massive factor. Can we measure it, work out where it is, and can we deal with it and try and make our soils more resilient so that compaction isn't something that they start to build up over time? The other parts that, apart from the sort of the breeding angle where we'd like to see, as I said before, newer varieties coming through faster with interesting traits and higher outputs potentially, is around crop nutrition. And again, the PGRO have been doing some of the same work that we've been doing at looking at how we can increase the level of nodulation, because the ability of these beans and peas, but beans in particular, to produce their own nitrogen, fixed nitrogen from the sky that they then use, and then that nitrogen carry over to the following crop. They can fix up to 400 kgs, but that's a number that's very rarely realised, excluding last year with the combination of the conditions we can't control, like the weather, temperature, moisture, etc. But there are there are factors we can control, and the data we've been collecting around nutrition has been a real eye-opener. And whether in the future, what I'd like to see is some change in the regulation around nitrogen in particular, although we're never going to move to a situation where we're applying nitrogen to the soil, and I don't think it'd be right to do that. The responsiveness of these legume crops to foliar applied like nitrogen late season. So we're talking small quantities, sort of, less than 10 kilos of N per hectare. But the ability of that nitrogen applied straight through the leaf to delay senescence has been really interesting in how that's consistently year on year in split field trials and in plot trials improving yields. And to the tune of 0.4 tonne a hectare is the average on one of our sites over 5 years worth of data. So that's a lot. So I think it's things like that, and we just need to get a better understanding of these crops that don't receive a lot of nitrogen do tend to be more responsive to other foliar nutrition. So it's about how we monitor, test. I'd like to see in wheat and other cereal crops, in partnership with a land crop, growth stage based curves were developed for tissue testing. So all farmers have probably seen this sort of more old fashioned color coded nitrogen right down through the nutrients on their tissue test results when they've sent it off to the labs. But the growth stage curves are a much better way of looking at it. It shows the demand of the nutrients for its different stages in its growth. We don't have those for legume crops at the moment, and I think trying to collect enough data for a land crop to be able to produce those would also be helpful, because we'd be able to look at it and say, well, look, where are we on that?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and some really big wins there. Thank you for sharing that with us, Todd. Thank you both. I'm going to pause there, and we're just going to check whether there's any questions from the audience. So Victoria, over to you.
Questions in yet?
If we've got no questions in, I would like to ask a couple of more cheeky ones. I'm so sorry. To carry on fielding. Oh, you've got one in?
Jenny, I can see your hand is raised. Would you mind just popping your question in the chat? I'm so sorry.
Brilliant. Just while we do, John, is there a particular carbon calculator that you found works particularly well for your farm?
I've had to do all the carbon calculators. The different people want different things. We're arable farming. We use soil carbon. So for the NCS project, we're using the farm. We've used them all from AgriCalc, and they're all painful and require a lot of work. And until recently, they all produce different results from the same data input. So the alignment amongst all of them is very something positive, I hope. And the thing is that the weather has a bigger impact on our carbon emissions from the arable crop. And it's purely down to how much imported soya and sunflower we use that impacts the egg production. And when it's harvest time, I use about 4 different weather apps to try and find the weather that I want. I think that carbon calculators tend to be a bit like that as well.
I do the same. Yes, I can relate to that. Super quickly, Todd, is there a particular carbon calculator that you found to be more effective or similar to John in that it's, that it can be quite variable?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with John. Cool Farm Toolkit seems to be the most common one I encounter, although I would share John's frustrations having sat with growers going through these processes of inputting data. And I think the direction of travel seems to be that more and more of that seems to have to take place for people wanting to sell grain on particular contracts. There's some quite progressive, interesting contracts out there that are aiming to reward growers for doing particular things to improve soil, reduce carbon emissions, but it's certainly usually far from straightforward and fairly time consuming. And as John said, the plethora of them, it would probably be quite helpful if there was a more of an industry standard one that everyone accepted and then used, but I doubt whether we're ever going to get to that point.
I also think that there's an external perception that farmers are going to get rewarded for carbon mitigation and sequestration, but I think if you in my experience, speaking to my peers and friends, that the expectation is that we're going to have to deliver these extra services, carbon mitigation, biodiversity increase and recovery. But all that's going to do, the reality is that the people that are buying it are going to expect that to happen in exchange for buying our product. And so there's a lot of talk about green malt and green milling wheats, and we're selling wheat and then setting the carbon into it. But I'm concerned that we're doing all of this. There's just going to be one more thing, another 5 days we have to spend in the office shoveling not manure but paper around for just to stay where we are, and it's a bit vexatious since we're on a public.
Yeah, brilliant.
So
Thank you both. Yeah, I
I
think we've
have
got
a
one question. Yeah, if we take that question, and
Sure.
then we're probably going to have to, just a couple of quick questions, quick as we can, and then we'll round up today.
Okay. To John and Todd, what are your thoughts on moving towards growing legumes for human consumption, and how to encourage farmers, policymakers, retailers and researchers to move into working with whole food, plant-based market and alternative protein producers?
Well, we before we started feeding beans to hens, grew them for human consumption, and they were exported to the North Africa and Mediterranean countries where they used them for a long time. And beans were in the north of France have always been used by people. And cultural changes means that beans are being used far more. But it's a bit, try to feed beans to hens or beans to people, it's the same issue. You need the certainty of demand, and you need the retailers and the consumers to stand up and say we're going to want it on a consistent basis. So in 2002 we won I think it was the national dried spring bean growing competition for growing beans for human consumption. We were the UK champions. 2019 it was. So we're growing home safe beans for human consumption are there, and it's just demand. It limits, if there was a demand, people would do more of it if they were paid for properly.
I'd agree. I think it's a combination of market demand and then again bottom line on farm in the field, and that's going to be achieved by market demand, but also by breeding. If we could increase the yield of the leguminous crops we're already growing, it's obviously going to make it more of an attractive proposition. The two sort of go hand in hand.
Thank you. Claire, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, because I think it might be quite a quick answer. Yes,
Okay.
so please go ahead.
Okay, so John, picking up on the comments around amino acid makeup of beans, meaning that the livestock are lacking everything that they need. Breeding this in is one solution, but a slow one. Lupins, however, have a much closer protein content and amino acid composition to soya. Could this be a better solution? Could this be a better solution, and what are the barriers to growing this more widely? And a final comment, perhaps, could this be included in the NCS project or as a follow-on?
So my personal experience, I sowed white lupins and they were looking fantastic, and then we got 9 degrees of frost in the beginning of May and the whole lot died off, and I've never tried them again. That was only 4 years ago. So we had a lot of lupins. So my problem has been the pesky weather and this change to climate where we get these really cold, traumatic cold spells that hit the east coast of our area anyway at that time of year. So we need a more frost tolerant variety. Otherwise, the highest yielding crop for protein for me had actually been lentils, but I had to go and buy them in bags from Hodmadod and grow them myself, and they grew green lentils, blue lentils. They were fantastic, but it was the year when the hottest place in Scotland, we broke the all-time record in September, the day we were combining them. It was a year a bit like this 2 years ago. So it's weather dependent,
That's the challenge. I think it is you mentioned soya earlier, Claire. I've had people grow soya, I've had people grow lupins, and some farmers don't grow peas and beans that are far more established because they would say they're risky, they're too inconsistent in their performance. Well, yeah, soya, lentils, lupins, at some point in the future when the climate's different perhaps, and when the variety breedings come on a bit more, but at the moment they are quite risky. I'm not so sure that's the way to really increase the UK legume acreage at the moment.
Thank you for those words of wisdom to end on, Todd. John, Todd, what a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. It's been utterly brilliant. The project is incredible. I've learned so much there. So thank you for sharing so generously with us today. We're breaking up for our summer break now. School's out for the summer. So we look forward to returning in September with more leaf surgeries. But until then, hopefully we'll see you at some of the summer events that we'll be at. We're at our usual spot in Groundswell, the very first stand as you come in. So please do come and say hello if you're going to Groundswell this summer. And yeah, other than that, I just want to wish you all a great summer. I hope for some great weather for you farmers, some rain in proper quantities. And yeah, thank you so much for all joining us for today's leaf surgery.